Well, hi, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a very special ICBA CAST, the voice of the Independent Contractors and Businesses Association. I'm Jordan Bateman, the Director of Communications for ICBA, joined as always by
Chris Gardner, President of ICBA.
And Chris, we have a guest today.
Yes, we're
finally
very excited. Yes.
Enough of you and me talking about taxes and housing and pretending we know what's going on. We have a pro. Anne McMullin is the President and CEO of the Urban Development Institute. Anne, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure. It's great to be here. Thank you.
For 42 years, ICBA has been the voice of BC's construction and responsible resource development industries. Today, 9% of the economy is construction. In fact, 250,000 people got up in British Columbia and went to work in the construction industry today. On the ICBA cast, we talk about politics and economic issues from a free enterprise, free market perspective. And there's no issue that people in Vancouver, we used to talk about the Canucks, we used to talk about weather. Now it's all housing all the time. And Anne, you are on the front lines of that. So first, what's it like to be on the front lines of the predominant public policy debate in BC?
Well, it's an enormous responsibility. As you outlined, this is a huge part of our economy. About 20 to 25% of our economy is relating to the construction and housing sector. What is it, $22 billion in GDP? And most importantly, it's the people that are employed in this industry. And I think that the politicians or, the public, they're trying to solve it in ways that I don't think are the right ways. And it's so critical, and I understand people's fears. I understand their concerns about rising house prices, but I don't think the way that we're addressing it is the proper way. And there are ways to look at it. Certainly, and I'm sure we'll get into it. The recent BC budget was, frankly, it's going to have the opposite effect.
So one of the things that we've been talking about a lot on our podcast is supply, the issue of supply, and just talk about that a little bit because there's been a lot of focus on taxes to somehow get us to an affordable housing market. Our view has been you've got to deal with supply.
We do have to deal with supply. And, that's a little bit complex too. But some people say, well, you look at the numbers and we're building enough homes. The starts are related to the people that are moving here. It's just not the case. We are not building enough. People say, well, there's 40 to 45,000 people moving here every year, and if you look at the housing starts, we're matching. But what we're not also accounting for is 100 and 120,000 students that come into this region every year. They're not part of the net migration, and we're not building for them. They're taking up rental properties. A lot of them are even buying out at UBC. Some of them, what they might classify as foreign buyers. And they're making a huge contribution to our economy and to our schools. They're keeping our universities, our schools open. Now, we can debate whether that's right or wrong, but what I can talk about is the issue of supply and that we are not meeting the needs we're not meeting the demand, we're not meeting the needs of the people who live in the Lower Mainland. We're not building enough housing.
No, absolutely not. Let's talk more about that in a second. I just want to mention that UDI and ICBA, we were two of the signatories for a letter regarding payroll taxes, the healthcare tax, so-called healthcare tax, to replace the MSP. I imagine, like us, you're concerned about the double dipping that's going on to start with, and then the burden on that. So maybe just mention why UDI signed on to that.
Well, I guess just as you said, it's the tax burden. We can't just keep taxing our way and expecting the economy to grow. I think we're in a little bit of a precarious situation. We're looking at changes, whether it's changes to NAFTA, or you're looking at some of the things that the federal Liberal government is doing. Even if we look at housing prices, when you've talked about how important it is the economy in the last 6 months without these tax measures, as the market does, we're seeing a leveling off of prices in the last 6 months, both in the single family and the multifamily. To then layer on more taxes and more costs, that's diminishes an employer's ability to give people raises so that they have more money to buy housing. We also know that that's one of the biggest issues in the Lower Mainland is the salaries compared to other regions. So, what we saw in this budget was just more taxes, and nothing about economic generation. And, again, even in our industry, in our sector, more supply creates more jobs, creates more money, and it even provides homes for people. So that's what we signed on.
Yeah. We were in budget lockup. We get the nice document, the 30-point housing affordability plan, Chris. So I'm flipping through the document thinking, surely 30 points, there's going to be one regarding supply. The only supply that was mentioned was government-built development. And you guys must have just been pulling your hair out at that point.
Oh, yeah. It was not only is our government built, I applaud the government that the part of it was a recognition that we need supply. Finally, we actually had a government that recognized it. 114,000 units over 10 years. But what we're going to, in order to pay for that, we're going to take $500 million out of the industry.
Yeah.
And then government is somehow going to take the lead and build things. That often does not go well, as we've seen over and over again in the past. And then there was this sense of, well, we're going to encourage municipalities to create more supply. We're going to work with. That is not a strategy. That is not a mechanism. Yeah. And I said to the Premier, we're looking at most municipalities in the Lower Mainland. To get anything approved can take 4 to 5 years. I said to the Premier, you're looking at 114,000 units over 10 years. We'll be well into the next election campaign before anything is built. So unless we address that, we won't be building rental housing for people that need it. We won't be building social housing, below market rental. You can applaud this all you want, but unless we deal with the issue of how do we get supply to market, we won't build any of that. Yeah. And we'll be another 5 years away from anything, and then 5 years from approvals, 2 or 3 years from construction. We're a generation away from even making a dent in this, and people need to realize that it is a crisis, not because of what the development industry is doing, but because the policies that are in place.
Yeah.
So on that issue of what local governments are doing, or in this case not doing, to get more supply on market, why is it taking so long to get? Why is there so much red tape and bureaucracy?
Well, there's a number of reasons. I think that a lot of it does have to do with public angst, and I understand that. There's enormous change going on rapidly and people feeling left behind, so they're fighting against it. But unfortunately, by fighting against it, it's actually making things worse. As well, I mean, in municipalities, there's the whole public hearing process, which I'm not opposed to, but it's hard to say. There is really what I would call so many regulations, so many policies. It's coming at us almost daily. How many trees can be left behind? The shadowing, says the shadow of the building at 2 o'clock, are we going to measure it at 4 o'clock?
Will there be a frost pocket?
Will there be a frost pocket? Is there enough of a setback? We say you want to build 3-bedroom units for family size, but every unit, the policies are every unit has to have a certain type of a window. We can't have what we call, this is a technicality, a borrowed light bedroom, where there's a bedroom in behind which has sort of frosted glass. It doesn't have. So to try to build a 3-bedroom, you've only got so many outside space. Yeah. Again, that makes it more costly. There's around sustainability, the type of windows that you use. But then maybe the type of windows that are used are then that's in conflict with a policy on heritage. It might be on the conflict on shading. And like I said, setbacks. So there's no hierarchy of policy, yet there's one policy. Parking regulations. Yep. It just goes on. Electric vehicle. Are we building enough? Is there enough public space? Is there enough art? Have you made allowances for daycares? Yeah.
Doorknobs.
Doorknobs. Oh, yes.
Right down to doorknobs.
Yes, yes. And you actually have people from the city coming in and looking at each individual unit, and so it just slows it down. And I do think there's also a bit of political bureaucratic paralysis, where people kind of are afraid to make decisions. What are the politicians going to get in trouble from the local community? We have people in Langley protesting townhomes. We have $1 billion transportation line through the Canby corridor. It's been there for 8 years, and we're still rezoning one building by one building, rather than saying, we're going to put 8 stories all the way along here. We're going to pre-zone it. Developers come in, build it, and be done with it. But no, every building is one at a time, right. Even though it's cookie cutter. Frankly, we shouldn't be building 8 stories at a major, a line that costs $1 billion. There should be high rises at those train stations. Yeah. And then maybe lower rise in between, and as we go out. I mean, it's not.
So really, we're doing it to ourselves.
We're doing it to ourselves. So you can blame the developers. It's easy to find a scapegoat. Let's blame the foreigners. Let's blame the developers. We're just following the rules. Yeah. But we are doing it to ourselves. And people say, what's the solution? We're all in this together. We all live here. We're all homeowners or renters. So what are we all going to do collectively to address this? And just taxing the foreign buyer, let's say it's 10% of the market. It's not working. Yes, okay, there's foreign buyers, there's foreign money, there's students, there's immigrants, there's downsizers, there's millennials, there's all of that. People who are opposed to development. So we need to look at all of this, a whole suite of things. But all we're doing is attacking the foreign buyer or the $3 million homeowner on the west side. That does not bring about more condos or more townhomes in Coquitlam.
Yeah. Politicians have to look in the mirror. And as a former Langley Township councillor, one of the most eye-opening experiences I ever had was sitting down with someone who built a beautiful project in Langley. And he sat down and he walked me through the profit margin. And that quickly eradicated any thought I had that developers were making bazillions of dollars off of these properties. And that was 10 years ago when our regulations were far less than what you see. Last project I did for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, one of the final ones, was a look at housing taxes in Vancouver. And we identified 110 different taxes, regulations, red tape, costs on developers. And, at some point, we've decided that housing should be taxed like cigarettes, as if it's something we're trying to eradicate.
Exactly. I was going to say the exact same. It's a bit like gasoline, and we've done a sort of a pie chart to look at. About 25% of costs in developing a home is taxes. Yeah. And so people say, well, it's so expensive, and you're only building stuff that for the rich. Well, when the taxes are so high, it makes it so expensive that either our units get smaller, so in order for people to afford it. Yeah. Or the bigger ones are just for the rich. And that is, you're forcing a price point when you add on 25% of the cost is taxes. So I can't build you a 3-bedroom for the same price as a condo, because on an $800,000 or $1 million unit, it's 230, whatever, 25% of that, $270,000 is in taxes. Yeah. So, it's not that hard to figure out. Yeah.
It's the taxes and the regulatory costs. So 25% is taxes.
And then there's the holding costs.
Yeah, and the holding costs. So for example, like regulatory costs, like BC Hydro requires you to make sure that there's enough power infrastructure in the building to power every single plug at 100% of the time. Well, most buildings will never use more than 25% of the power ever. So you could do it like 50%, even with electric vehicles. But all that extra infrastructure goes on, and it ends up being passed down to the final buyer. Let's talk about holding costs, because that's where this delay really kills housing affordability. Is if it takes you 3 to 5 years just to get into the ground, that's 3 to 5 years that someone is paying for a mortgage, for taxes, soon to pay a speculation tax, all of that nonsense.
Exactly. And again, that gets passed on, Or the other thing is what we're potentially going to be seeing with these new taxes is that the cost gets to be so high that it actually limits supply. That, on this piece of land, it's cost so much in the school tax, the new speculation tax, the new property transfer tax. You're adding millions of dollars onto a land assembly. And then at some point the developer says, well, I can't build what anybody can afford. So I'm going to hold that land for 10 years, almost reduce supply until prices go back up. You create a pent-up demand, and that's what we saw with foreign buyers tax 2 years ago, is people went to the sidelines. They didn't want to buy because is the market going to crash? Developers sort of said, all right, let's put our tools down. Let's sort of hold off here. 6 months later, when they realized, what happened? The prices skyrocketed. Yeah. We go back to 2012 when we did see sort of what we call the supply buffer, where we did feel that supply was really in line with demand, and that's the last time that prices were kind of reasonable. Since then, you look at housing starts, or you look at the supply on the market compared to demand. In 2012, they were pretty even. In the last 6 years, it's just been like this. The demand has taken off, and the supply has just kind of been creeping. The supply has basically stayed the same. And I also look at our federal government policies on immigration. Democratically elected government, they want to increase the immigration by a huge percentage point. That's great. We're not in the business of debating whether that's right or wrong. Well, what we're saying is the province and the municipalities need to be in line with that, and they're not. So that's why we're seeing the 4 and 5 year wait times, because they're not actually addressing the kind of federal policies and even provincial policies that we have around growing our economy through immigration.
So that's an interesting point, because it seems to me that so much of the choke point here happens at city halls across Metro Vancouver and other parts of British Columbia. But we have the municipal elections coming up at the end of this year in November. And do you think this is going to be an issue that voters are going to go to the polls thinking about? Because it seems to me that local governments often sort of this doesn't sit on their doorstep. It's often viewed from the perspective of what is the province going to do, less so what City Hall is going to do. And you also have lower voter turnout in municipal elections, which I think compounds the problem.
Absolutely, and that's why municipalities are reluctant to make the big decisions, because it does mean change, and that there's very few people that go out and vote, and will they be tossed out of office? Yeah. And that is a huge issue. And I understand that. So we've said to the province and the federal government is you need to, in a sense, help municipalities. They really are being downloaded with the issue and expected to deal with it. And there's not that, three governments working together and even saying to the communities, this is why we're doing this, and this is how we work together to bring about the kind of housing that's needed, rather than we just fight on a project-by-project basis. And yes, this is going to be an election issue for the municipal governments, and our fear is that it will be that backlash, is that somehow people think that I'm going to vote people out of office that want to see growth or more supply, as though that helps the problem, and it doesn't. It might make us feel good, but it doesn't help the problem. We need to embrace this both as municipalities and as a region. How are we going to address, I keep saying the word supply, people don't like to hear it, but how are we going to build the kind of houses that people need? And we need to look at taxes. We need to look at the costs. We need to look at these, these...
Well, density is another issue.
Forms.
Yes,
Everyone fights against density.
Yeah.
Everyone talks about it, but as soon as you propose the new tower, the new seniors complex in your neighborhood, people go crazy and say, no, we don't want it.
That's right. People say, we want more rental. We haven't built rental in this province for 30 years. We have a few rental buildings coming on now because the economics are working with low interest rates. And frankly, zero vacancy rate, so the prices for renting is high. But that can change in an instant. And
especially if you get the kind of rent controls that some people want.
Yes, and what it does is it curtails the building of rental. And that's what people don't understand. There's always the unintended consequences. And so, I was on a radio program the other day, and well, why don't you build more rental? Well, we're trying to build more rental. We've got thousands of units in the pipeline trying to build rental. But it's actually hard to also build a rental building in a community. Renters are, they're transients.
Yeah.
They're not wealthy enough, or
they don't care about.
They don't
the
care
like
about
investment,
and that's I think we need to change our attitude about who renters are.
Yeah, that's right. You mentioned
unintended social housing or below market in your neighborhood.
Exactly. Yeah. You mentioned unintended consequences, and maybe this is the last thing to ask you about the property transfer tax. So, one of the things that didn't happen in the last election is no one bothered to look at the Green Party or NDP platforms. The Green Party had a platform that talked about just ratcheting up property transfer taxes as much as like 10 or 15% on large things. NDP have stolen a little bit from that. In their budget, they came out and said, properties over $3 million, we're going to slap another 2% property transfer tax. That sounds great to the average person because they're like, yeah, screw that Lululemon guy, Canaccord boy, you should be paying more. You're making $33 million properties. The unintended consequence of this is, I live in Langley where a lot of the growth is going on. I live in Willoughby, right where all the growth is going on. Developers can't assemble land anymore without paying this extra 2%, and it's to get another cost that's going to end up trickling down to the eventual owners of those townhouses and condos.
That's just it. They buy the land, you buy the land at market price or whatever it is, and now we've got this new tax coming in, 2% on the value. The government has admitted that they didn't mean to capture what we call development land assemblies, greenfield land, in what we call multi-phase projects, where you've got a number of acres of land and you're going to be building over time. Now that is going to be subject to the speculation tax because it is, quote, vacant. So what does that do? It adds cost to the development, to housing. We'll either pass it on to the consumer if the market can bear, or it won't get built. And again, reduced supply, demand stays the same, prices go up.
And we don't understand that City Hall, often, Langley, for example, wants a mix of housing on every parcel, which means different stratas, which means those properties end up getting sold and resold, and the assembly happens, and then it kind of goes.
Right.
So you're paying that luxury tax over and over and over again.
So we looked at there's I think 31,000 homes in the Lower Mainland. They're over $3 million. Great, slap the rich, whatever the rich. But we think that that's probably only 10% of actually the value of what we call development land. So it's really going to be captured on land that is slated for development for new homes, including rental homes. We can't even build. So you buy land and you want to build rental. You've got to wait 3 or 4 years to have it approved. You're paying 2% on that $30 million value of land. And the school tax is marginal, but still, it's in addition. And then you assemble it, you build, and then you sell. Well, then you're paying another property transfer tax, and you're paying an extra 2%. It's 5% over $3 million. Again, sounds good. Get this guy in Shaughnessy to pay for my schools or daycares or whatever. That's not what's happening. You're all paying for it in the development of new homes, or those new homes won't get built. And I think there's finally a bit of a recognition the penny dropped with the government. Well, that wasn't our intention. With the empty homes tax in the city of Vancouver, it was the same thing. Get those empty homes. Okay, we understand the intention, but what you've done is now captured all this empty land that is slated for development. They got it right away. They've exempted development land. And we said that to the province. You've got to exempt development land from these new taxes. And they've agreed that wasn't the intention, but there's 50 municipalities with 50 different sets of rules. So now the challenge is going to come up with regulation or legislation to try to undo what they've done.
Yeah.
You know, and the funny thing is, Anne, you make
shake
so
your
much
head.
sense. Why didn't the government talk to you before they went down this path in the budget? Because clearly, you know, one of the things that any government needs to do is consult with the private sector, understand what the challenges are and what the solutions really are, and they haven't done this in this case, and we're all going to pay for it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
UDI.org? Is that where
Yes.
people go? Excellent. So go check out what they're working on there. You have a great public policy wing that churns out the information that groups like us use to try to figure out what's going on. More people should listen to you and not to date Tom Davidoff, but that's another story for another time.
Tom's not a bad guy.
Yeah, that's right. No, Tom's a good guy. Tom's a good guy. He just operates in theoretical land. The rest of us have to operate in real world, and that causes some differences. But if there was an economist party, I'm sure Tom Davidoff would do well. Anyways, ICBA CAST will be back soon. Stay tuned throughout the week. We have little quick hitters with folks who are dropping by our office. And Chris and I next week are going to try a few little podcasts on breaking news items. So this will be exciting.
I'm sure there'll be no shortage of breaking news.
Yeah, it's not with this government. ICBA.ca, at ICBABC on Twitter, Facebook.com/the ICBA. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Thank you.